Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mad Palace podcast. My name is Aden Ng, author of the Chronicles of Terra web serial novels, and the host of today's episode. For those joining us, the Mad Palace is a podcast by a group of writers of varying backgrounds, publication histories, experiences, and genres. We're here to talk about anything and everything to do with writing and storytelling. So let's be introduced to our guests.
I'm Jennifer Flath, author of the Black Pearl series, a fantasy series. That was it. That's all I have.
Oh. My name is J.A. Waters, and I am the author of Lencia and Oceans of Shelter, and you can find me at J.A. Waters Author.
All right, so for today's episode, we are talking about world building. I'm guessing all of us have done something along the line of world building to a certain extent. Do you guys care to share about your own personal worlds? Because I understand that we're all fantasy writers here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So Joe's world I find the most interesting.
Oh.
Not saying
Thanks.
that Jet.
Well said.
Well,
No pressure.
no pressure, right? Yes. Well, it's just I'm really big on high fantasy world building. Like something that has a long history and in depth. And your world is pretty much like that, if I'm right.
So, sure. I mean, to summarize it as much as I can, Lencia and Oceans of Shelter both take place on a world called Nalan. Nalan has no relation whatsoever to our world. It is completely fictional and it has a long history that goes back to the creation myths that actually caused the universe to be born all the way until whenever the current story that I'm writing takes place.
And Jen, what about your world? Care to give a brief explanation as well?
Yeah, mine's a fantasy world that is a totally disconnected place. I've never come up with sort of a location in space. Each of the boundaries of the world sort of is impassable for some reason. Maybe someday I'll figure out what's the bigger meaning. I do have people in this high fantasy world that are a futuristic group of people that may or may not be us, or they may just be from some other world. I'm thinking it's something dimensional. That's sort of my idea. But anyway, it's basically a high fantasy world. Maybe the most interesting thing is that it's a high fantasy world, but the most powerful and influential group of people were matriarchal. So it sort of flipped the idea of kings and queens and knights and castles on its head a little bit.
Right, so it's like a reverse traditional.
A little bit. But
Right.
the group of people that are still alive have no particular reason to be matriarchal, so they're more influenced by that thinking than I don't know, than having a real reason to be that way.
They're just kind of doing it because that's the way they've always done it.
Yeah, that's their model.
I think that's like a really nice way to, build a world. Like it has always been like that. It should always be like that. And I wonder, like, when you two are building your worlds, like how far in depth do you make your worlds? Because for myself, when I make my World of Terra, it's what it's called a hard fantasy. So everything needs to fit like a jigsaw, and it has to make some sort of physical sense in like a scientific way in a fantasy world. So for me, I have to go really in depth. But what about you two? I understand Joe has a lot of Joe's world focuses a lot on the mythology, but Jen, yours is a bit more free forming.
Yeah, I'd say I split the middle. Like, there's definitely physical laws, but there's a lot of magic that is just natural to things and people in the world. So there are a lot of things that are allowed to break rules. And since it's not based off of our world, if I want to break rules, like allow people to be able to dive hundreds of feet underwater with no consequences, I'll just let that happen. That's
And
the most recent one that comes to mind. I did a lot of underwater things, and at a certain point, I was like, oh, how far can they be underwater without facing any of these consequences that I know will happen?
but
And then I
wait.
decided, who cares? Who cares? Water doesn't have the same pressure, anything in
It's
this
Science,
world.
magical water.
science, yes, it's magic now.
Yeah, well, and the fun thing for me is that I have a scientist who understands like our general physical rules, and so I get to laugh about it
It's an in
sometimes.
joke.
It's usually just an in joke with myself,
Yeah.
yes. Those are the best kind, the ones that only the author understands.
All right. What about you, Joe? Yours is a lot more, mythological. There's gods and but there's also technology for yours.
Um, so mine is based on the idea that all of the physical rules still apply as if it were our world. So it takes place in a universe that follows the same rules of, these kind of atoms exist and these kind of elements exist, and this is how they get constructed together. It's just kind of boring in the fact that now everything also there's one additional capability to have magic of a kind, and it's just kind of called spirit, the way I describe it. But otherwise, the world should behave mostly the same. But what would happen if all of this power existed, and also there just happened to be these crazy powerful gods that have always existed?
I think like for fantasy at least when we are doing these kind of thing we like to add a little bit of magic. We add a magical element to explain all the things that we're doing. How far do you usually take it when you're doing that? Like, do you try to explain away magic as magic and or is there like a scientific reason for magic? Like in my Terra series, magic and science are considered the same thing because they come from similar sources. So do you guys don't have the do you guys have the same issue or at least the same approach to doing that?
Mine is blood based, so it's something you're actually born with, and it would be another sense. I mean, I've described it like another muscle, so something that you're physically using, but it's a supernatural ability that you're born with or not.
Yeah, and mine is definitely anyone can do it, but some people can do it better. And there are certain things that can happen to you or that you can do to yourself that will make it more powerful. So I often hear this as kind of like wild magic versus nature magic versus, kind of all of the Dungeons and Dragons, a paladin versus a druid versus a wizard versus a
Right.
mage. Like some of them have to study, and some of them it just kind of is born into them somehow. Um, and I think most of the way I've got Nalan constructed, it's a wild magic that you can learn.
Well, that makes it interesting because we're all on the fantasy genre here, and it seems like even though we're working on the same genre, we all ended up on a relatively different spot of fantasy, or at least a world of fantasy. So I'm wondering, perhaps maybe it's our process of world building that makes it different.
Yeah, I one of the things that I was definitely going to say as far as world building goes is that it's not something that I do first. Like my world will build itself based on what kind of world I need the characters to live in or what kind of world I need the plot to be happening in. So I'll try to make things consistent, and I love magical rules and magical systems and magical postal systems in particular. I need to work on a new one of those. Um, but that's not where I start. I always start with the characters and then what I want the characters to be able to do, and then sort of if you have people in a world, what would that world look like if people were able to do these things? What would that do to the world, and what would the world do to them? So I never do world building sort of disconnected from my characters, I guess.
But do you do it where the characters themselves, like, they just have motivations? They're just kind of like this bundle of life, and that builds the world? Or do you have this character will go through this event or series of events, and that builds it?
The second sounds more familiar to me. So it's both like the character and the plot necessities of that character, and then okay, and here's the kind of world that would be most fun to put them in.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating to me because I don't I've never really actually thought that well, I came up with the questions for this episode, but I've never actually outside of planning for this episode that thought about that there might be other methods of world building. Because for me, I never focus on the world, nor do I focus on the character. I built the world around the story. So like I would have an idea for a story. I finish the story, and then the world expands from that story, regardless of character or the world that was already there. It's like fitting the piece of a world from somewhere else, if that makes any sense.
I
Sort
think
of.
so.
Uh,
No, so it sounds like
I'm,
you're saying that
I,
you take you have a story idea, you have a series of events that have to happen in your mind, and then you design the world around that.
right. It might have come a bit from because I started writing from fan fiction, so I always built onto other people's world. So it might have come from that. Maybe that's like the way we start off writing or how we train ourselves or whatever
From
process we
reading,
get
right?
into. Yeah, from reading or writing or storytelling or enjoying movies, and we take processes from those what that we are familiar with and put it in.
So when do the
But
characters get added into your worlds? Is it the events first, then the world, then the characters, or is it events, characters, world?
so there's a story, so I'm guessing events, character, and then the world. But then the world already exists, it's just not added in yet, I guess.
No, I feel that way too. Where, okay, the latest short story I wrote at the end of the Black Pearl series, I'm for sort of the first time the point of view character is a character who has lived hundreds of years of history of my world, and it was really scary because she at every point she knows more about my world than I do, and it was hard to write from her point of view because I know that there's this history and that it all exists and this war that happened and all of these things and the people were this way, and it already exists.
Did you have to like go back and re timeline stuff, or
It's more than that. I mean, a little, but it's more than that though. It's this history of the world that already exists that I don't know yet.
that
And
sounds
But
so
nuts?
from from
yeah.
what I understand, Joe has similar characters as well that lives for hundreds of thousands of years as well. Do you get that same process as Jen when you're writing about it?
So I guess on Milan, the way I started was so when I first started writing Lincia, there was no world. So Lincia was definitely this character is going to go through this arc. Um, I've had a long history of. I used to play a lot of role playing games that were constructed like on the fly, where I would be the GM or someone else would be the GM, but the whole world was constructed, and we were kind of getting into a point where we were almost like elitist as GMs, where the more detailed, the more you added to the world, the more you created, the cooler the game was. Even if the game failed, at least you created a really good thing, you know? Um,
Right.
so Nalan was created in that line of thought where I had this story that I wanted to tell about this princess, and then I went back in time to the dawn of creation, and then I timelined it out. Basically, I have eras built out where in this era this happened, and then this era and this era, and blah blah blah. So I have characters that lived that whole time, and they know everything that has happened, but I also know it because I gave them that history, and a lot of that I did. It's kind of a combination of our history and the history of Earth, but also it's a combination of a bunch of other stuff that I've created over the last like 20 years of just creation.
I
So
do have a
Jen,
lot of timelines with very basic details. So I have a lot of timelines with basic details. I don't have a lot of the why necessarily people did the things that they did. And for the major events with people who are dead, the wars, the big players that influenced sort of.
So is it the people themselves or just this war happened?
Right. Well, I know a little bit more than this war happened, but yeah, the people who died in those wars and what they specifically died fighting for, some of that
I mean,
that this character in particular would have been a part of and that would have shaped her. Some of that was sort of a mystery to me.
do you ever like think of those stories and want to go back and explore them?
I would like to do sort of the prequel with Rin's mom and Sri Linda and sort of the last big, sort of the end of that big war. I would definitely love to do that. I just have never really gotten inspired to write that book. It's something that I want to do sometime, but it's never at the top of my list of I must and I have this story.
it's like how invested you are in that particular story, right?
Yeah, for sure. The
It's like
story just hasn't come to me yet.
right. Feels like it's a bit like a skill between having a world prepared and having uh, some things prepared to having non-prepared. When you said you are interested in doing a prequel, have you ever thought like maybe there's a difference maybe between like when you're building a shorter, more standalone story compared to all these grand fantasy worlds that we do?
Oh, sure. I mean, do you mean like a standalone short story?
Yeah,
Just
like
something different? Yeah.
when you're writing standalone stories, do you go through the same process for the world building for those standalone stories?
No. I don't.
Done.
I don't think
That's it.
I
That's
don't
it.
think I
Show's
do.
over. So it's like a different process of world building compared to your larger story for your standalones.
Yeah, gosh, what is my process? I think world
Uh,
building for me really it's a later step for me. It happens when does it happen? It happens when the story,
I feel like
Would would you
she's having
require
a
right?
that to
crisis.
happen?
Yeah. And in a shorter story, I would stay really tight in probably on the characters. Let's see, I did write a science fiction story that I guess I really wanted it to be about these two. Um, in the future, I wanted they were basically beta testers for new technology, and they were testing wings, basically glider wings, and I I did sort of go through this process of what would a future world look like where, all of these new technologies were so mundane to people, and it was just like a 9 to 5 job to get to strap wings to your back and almost die in the process of testing this new thing. And so in a sense, I guess that was like it was like mini world building because I
So
sort
you
of thought
still
about.
you build something around the story, even though it's just something small.
Yeah. So I have more of a sense of what the world looks like than showed up in that story. I think that's what world building is to me, when the world is bigger than the story.
It's like if the world is not as big as a story, you could just borrow something from life.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're writing something real where all of what's happening in real life is just going to apply, and people can fill in the blanks if you don't give them the information, um I feel like maybe it's still world building, but it's the reader doing it. Because if you
Right.
don't give the reader the information, they're going to have to put the pieces together themselves, and they'll either take what's familiar or sort of evidence that you've left for them. I don't know. I think I
Oh.
just said two different things,
No.
both in the same thought.
I think I think you're on the right track. Um, actually, that sounds like what Joe did. I read your short story to the moon or something.
Oh, from Earth to the
Um,
Moon, I think.
yes, correct. Yeah. That was interesting because it was sort of in the near future, but it's obviously the same sort of world that we know now, but at the same time, there's something different about it. But you don't actually explore it entirely in the story itself. Do you have like a something fleshed out for that, or is it just winging it and letting the readers, decide?
So that story, and I'm gonna try not to get too off topic, but that story in particular it's supposed to be longer. There's supposed to be a whole book around what happens next that I've got kind of plotted out. So there is more backstory and there is more world building going on then. But the key, trying to stay back on world building topic, is that the closer it is to reality, and that story is very close to our Earth. It is on our Earth, or our moon in this case, and when I can do that, when I can have a story take place on our reality, in our reality, I don't feel like adding those details that everybody knows. I don't feel like it adds anything to the story. I feel like you can let the reader just kind of naturally assume a lot, and it actually adds to the story to let them fill in those gaps.
Yeah, I'm with you. I was writing down a question, and that goes right into it. And from what Aiden said, how much world building do you guys appreciate in books that you read? Like, how far do you like the author to take you? I mean, like Tolkien, or are we talking, I don't know,
Lewis
somebody that,
Carroll.
yeah.
I would say Kuntz, he has a lot of stories that takes place in America, and that's one of those things that I found a bit, underwhelming about his stories is that um, a lot of them are just the settings are quite plain. It's the
Mhm.
stories himself that interest. Like he doesn't actually build anything. He doesn't do any world building. He
Yeah,
just
I would agree
has
that
the
his
story.
settings. I would agree that his settings are just. They just. He's almost got talking head syndrome. Is I guess what I feel like with Kuntz.
Yeah, because I mean, I know that I prefer, boy, I guess it's sort of an in-between thing for me because I really don't want to have to sit through the entire history of your world that you made up because it has no meaning to me. But I know some people probably would really enjoy that. And on the other hand, if there's nothing different in the world and there's no, you don't give your story sort of a time and place that matters to the people who are in it, I don't much like that either. So
It's
But I
about
feel like you need
balance.
like
I'm thinking like Hunger Games is sort of that balance for me where there's this world with this really deep history, but the people are living it. You're not hearing about it.
yeah, but I feel like for those stories you do need a strong idea of the world so that when you are writing them, it comes across. Okay,
Yeah, oh,
you have
absolutely.
this great grand world with a lot of details that are not being touched on. Uh, but when you're writing a story focused on a character or an event, you just want to focus on those characters and events, and it helps when you know what you're talking about basically, and you're not just sometimes pulling things out of thin air, you know.
So no, I agree. I like a story that feels like the author thought things through, and not
Right.
necessarily to the point where they detail this is made from adamantium scales in 1432, whatever. I don't care. None of that matters to me. I mean more like, does the author know why this is taking place? Do they have a good
Right.
concrete reason? Basically, it's almost like a social motivation, or a cultural motivation. Because I mean, a culture just doesn't go. Today we're going to be medieval, and tomorrow we're going to be future. There's got to be
Right.
something in between for me.
Right. It's like when they're explaining the world, it must sound natural as it's always been there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was really tough for me writing the second Black Pearl book, Memory Spell, because I got a lot further into sort of the impact of the matriarchal society, but I'm not sure how well I conveyed the impact that I felt was there.
So
Um just what that did because all of the people that it really impacted were dead, and I brought a bunch of them back sort of into this new world 10 years in the future for them. And it was hard to sort of skate that line of, okay, here's this thing that I don't want to beat you over the head with, but it's so backwards from our world that people have already filled in all of these blanks. And it was hard to tell if people could see how opposite. I feel
Right.
like people had already sort of mm, just put the high fantasy kings and queens sort of mask on the world, and it was hard to say, but this one's actually pretty different. There aren't the same male female roles. Even though you see them, they're not looked at the same way.
so you said you had trouble relating how you feel about it. Does that?
Yeah, right? No, I had trouble. I just had trouble putting it on paper in a way that wasn't really straightforward. Here's this thing. Trouble showing it. I wasn't sure how direct to be.
Almost
with
like
the
you
reader.
you didn't want to just straight out go, "Hey, this is what this society is like," but you also didn't want it to be so subtle that nobody notices.
Yeah, exactly.
I think like Ryan Ward, our friend Ryan Ward, his Flock series does that really well, because in his world they trade stories as a currency, and he does it as a matter of fact thing. So it's such a sharp difference from what we know, but when you just put it in as a matter of fact, it creates like this. It's always been there, and you as a reader know that it's different, but it feels natural, I think.
Yeah, I really like that. It's a cool system. And it makes sense somehow, even though it doesn't make sense. How do you pay for things with stories? I wonder that every time. I'm like, but
No,
how does this work?
but no, it totally makes sense, and
It
I
does.
mean, I really love Ryan's version of where performance is a sort of, that's a valuable asset, and we do that in
Right.
our life, where if you go and like put on a concert, you're gonna get paid for it. It's just in his
They
world, it's
just
more
cut out the
direct.
middleman.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
I, I think that's interesting. Like, um, because world building is such a broad thing to do. You can go in deep, into even the economy, the history, the politics, or you could just, say, I'm just gonna add magic to New York or Chicago, or make Ghostbusters or something.
Yeah, but
It
then the problem there, especially with if you're gonna use something that everyone knows, something like New York or just even just normal reality, I think the problem is, when did it happen? Because if you just add magic and say it's always been that way, then without going all the way back, then how did that influence everything? Like Harry Potter got
well,
around that by going, "Oh no, no, it's a secret
Oh,
world."
yeah.
So that's
Only these few select
right.
people know, and they've always known. I really love when a story can do that, though. Like Harry Potter, when they can say, well, there's been these people that have known, and it has been here, and there have been suspicious things that you've probably noticed that are part of it, but it's always been explained away or covered up, or your memory's been modified. I
Right.
like I like when a world can do that.
I'm I'm a bit like what Joe said. I don't really like worlds that they make great grand changes to like the physics of the world, and there's no consequences in the past or the future. Like, everything's
Mhm.
normal up to the point of the story. If it's a comedic piece, that's fine, but serious stories does that as well, and it just sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense. I think that's why we have so many alternate history fiction
Yeah.
yeah.
writers as well.
Don't even get me
Right.
started on lazy like
Right.
time travel stories where only the one thing that they changed changes in the future. Come on. I
I
mean, if
have
you actually made a change that you're seeing in the future, more things are going to change.
That's not how
You
any
can't
of
just
this works.
remove a person.
I write time travel stories, and I always have to get past that paradox. It's so frustrating that if you, especially when you're working on a hard fantasy world, when you break something, everything breaks, and I think
Mhm.
that's reality. Reality is just hard reality.
Yeah, it's just don't get into time travel. That's the lesson here. Just don't.
Oh, I I
Already
can't do
broke.
anything about it. Already broken. Already broken. All right. So I guess that's all the time we have. I think this is a topic that we might explore again in the future. But for now, thank you all for watching. My name is Aden Ng. I'm the author of the Chronicles of Terra web serial novel. You can find me at Aden_Ng. Joining me today, we have.
Jennifer Flath, author of, whoops, can you hear me? Jennifer Flath, author of the Black Pearl series. You can find me on Twitter at Jen with two N's Snork, Snork, and on Facebook, something like the Black Pearl series. I don't know. Look it up. It's there.
I had to hold in all my laughter. Thank you for making that difficult. I am J.A. Waters, and I can be found at J.A. Waters Author on Twitter, also on Facebook. And I wrote Lincia and Oceans of Shelter, two high fantasy stories.
Prove it.
What?
Okay, I can understand. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Let me double check. Yes, I am recording.
All right. As Jen once said, you haven't been recording. We've been so fantastic up to this point.
I know.
Hello,
Miss-
everybody. Welcome. Oh,
Sorry. I'm just gonna be quiet.
Well, don't be quiet after,
right.
No,
Is Joe still there?
Can you still hear me?
Joe.
Joe.
That's easy to edit out, right?
Yes. I can just like zoop.